Welcome back. We're doing a very special episode today. We're going to do a crossover between BDSM and my background as a dominatrix and Jungian psychology. As you can see, I'm dressed a little sexy today just for shits and giggles. I was like, I'm going to go put on what I used to wear when I did camming. So I was an online dominatrix during the pandemic too. So yeah, this was the dominatrix get up. I know it's not what you think of when you think dominatrix, but my brand was actually something called a mommy dom. So it was pretty simple, lots of cute little pearl necklaces. I would always wear just like a little bit of makeup, a cardigan with just like a little bra and like a skirt or shorts or something like that. It was always pretty comfy. I do remember there was a period of time where I tried to go hard dom, but it just wasn't really in my personality. So I didn't make a lot of money as the hard dom. I did try though. I'll see if I can go back into the archives and find some photos from when I tried to be a little bit of a harder dom, but I really ended up settling on what was called the mommy dom. And when I did my dominatrix work, I learned a lot, by the way. So just for background, I've always been kind of a kinky person. I'm a queer person. So I had some knowledge of the BDSM world and kink before coming onto the scene and doing professional dominatrix work. However, there was so much more that I did not know that I learned on the job. And this was so much fun for me. And I really nerded out about different fantasies and fetishes and kinks and tried to understand the psychology behind it. This topic came up to talk about because one, I think that it was the one thing that I wish someone had talked about when I was trying to figure all this stuff out. And also, what's been on my mind recently, personally, is about how your personal expression, whether that be through art, whether that be through sex, whether that be through any kind of creative outlet, is so important on your journey to healing and your journey to shadow work. And what a lot of people don't understand is that BDSM is a form of shadow work. Also, just generally things like your fantasies, your kinks, your desires, and how they show up in the bedroom, a lot of times your unconscious mind will show itself in this arena. So it's a really important topic to cover, especially because there is so much shame in our culture about sex and sexuality. And especially if you're interested in like spicier aspects of sexuality or kinky, we do have a stigma in our society around that. And I think a lot of people don't get the right education because of it. So don't worry, mommy's here. We're going to go over it today. So while I am pulling up my notes for this episode, I want to talk about generally the types of clients that I would attract as a mommy dom. So obviously as the mommy, did attract some clients that would consider themselves to be littles. And this would be people that really like dressing up like little kids basically, and had some sexual arousal or desire with the idea of embodying a childlike version of themselves. It could sometimes be sexual, sometimes not. A lot of times it was actually just about like the nurturing. I would read people bedtime stories and things like that. And I know people get squicked out when it comes to kids stuff, and I totally get it, but we're going to dig into that today around what that really is, where it's coming from. But I also attracted a lot of sissies, which were men who, honestly, many of them were trans questioning, but would identify with femininity in their sexuality, like to dress up and do lots of dress up stuff. So in those containers, it was a lot of, dress up for me type of play and type of scenes where I was more of like a supportive figure. There was a lot of those clients that weren't really sexual at all either. It was more, I was like a supportive mother figure, honestly, in them exploring their gender identity. And then I also had my sector of what they call forced bi, and forced bi is essentially men who are actually bi. I can't say that they're not, but they can't express that in their everyday life. So they pay a dom to tell them to go, suck a D or whatever. Like, then it's not gay if a woman asks them to do it or a woman makes them do it. So I understand the stigma and the shame behind some of these sexual desires so much so. It's like because I work with them on a daily basis. But what I really aim to do in my dominatrix work, which I also aim to do in any work that I do, is to destigmatize this stuff, de-shame this stuff, and let people feel empowered in their desires and not have them feel so bad about it. So today I'm going to start talking about different fetishes or kinks in BDSM, ones that I'm specifically knowledgeable about. I'm going to talk today about how some of these expressions of sexuality actually have a roots in a shadow, in an unconscious desire or an unconscious fear. And again, as I'm going through this, I am not pathologizing anything. I also think that sometimes you just like something because you like it, and it doesn't need to even be deeper than that. But our unconscious mind does play a big part in our sexual imagination and expression. So I just have a literal list of notes here of just things that came on the top of my head that I wanted to bring up because I think that they're very interesting and are important to share with people so that they can think about this from a Jungian perspective. But there are certain fantasies that seem to be based on collective societal shadow. So if you saw my episode on collective trauma, collective experiences, how that affects people's psyches and groups, you will see that certain fantasies will come on the scene after certain big events in humanity. So for example, after the 2008 financial crash, then this new fetish kind of pops up on the scene, or maybe it wasn't new, it might have been something that had happened before, but it became much more popular. Let's just say that. It became a lot more popular, and that was something called findom, okay? And these are essentially men that have the fetish that some woman has control of their bank account, can take all of their money, can drain them, make them this like pay pig and just take all of their money. It's basically the kink of financial insecurity. And obviously, just like all BDSM, there are rules put in place. And any ethical dominatrix wouldn't truly drain someone's entire bank account in the form of play. But that is kind of how it would get set up is, oh my gosh, here's my bank login. Oh no, please don't drain me of all my money. So findom became a huge thing in like the early 2010s. So that's an example of, let's say, a collective thing affecting the psyches of many people that now becomes almost like a trend in fetish. Some other generalizations that I'm just going to make, again, generalizations. Whatever neurodivergency I have, I'm very good at processing patterns, but I have seen the pattern that many people that have high-powered jobs or lots of responsibilities, they're more likely to want to engage in submission in the bedroom. So you have to think about it this way. In your conscious life and what you're doing every day, I'm in control. I'm the leader. I'm the dominator. I make sure things happen, right? In my life, in my career. So the unconscious desire is actually to perhaps maybe not have to be in control all the time. So you'll find that people that are generally very dominant in their life tend to enjoy submission in the bedroom. And I've also noticed that when people maybe feel trapped, purposeless, or feel like they're not in control of their life in some way, they will tend to want to play out more dominant fantasies in the bedroom. It's kind of the opposite, but again, it's the shadow of what's consciously going on will sometimes show up in the bedroom as a desire or something that you may want to do. And again, nothing wrong with this. It's just the way that the shadow likes to play sometimes. But this is why it's important to think about your sexual psyche as an expression of your shadow, so that instead of enjoying something and immediately being like, I'm ashamed of that, why did I like that? To be able to have an open mind or some curiosity, like, wow, that was really interesting. I'm feeling like I I'm being turned on by this lately, or maybe I have a fixation on this certain thing, and why is that? There is some work you can do around that versus just being ashamed of it and shoving it in the background. There might be some nuggets of information in there for you. Also, I've noticed that conservative or religious people tend to have cuckolding fantasies, essentially having someone sleep with their wife, or perhaps the forced gay type fantasies. Essentially things that are so egregious in conservative culture end up being the thing that conservative people generally really like in bed. And on the flip side, people that are more liberal tend to have more fantasies around imprisonment, bondage, things like that, because it goes against their true desire for freedom or anti-fascism. They might enjoy more prisoner type fantasies in the bedroom. You can even think about this on a collective level for women. Women's number one fantasy, if you go look up the data, is usually around ravishment or being taken by force. And that is one of the biggest collective fears that women do actually have. So again, this fantasy will come out through the sexual psyche. And also too, I want to explain that there's something about this from a nervous system level that essentially helps heal either past traumas or the fears, because you are in control of that narrative and how it plays out if you're doing it in your own personal sex life. Now, if you're feeling ashamed or really bad after a sexual experience, then you're probably not getting the benefits out of it. If it's actually harming you more psychologically than helping you. But think about it that way, is your nervous system's way of wanting to replay something that it finds really scary in a pleasurable sense. Now I'm just going to briefly talk about different types of fetishes or fantasies that are rooted in like shame and fear and disgust, and the ones that are rooted in repressed desires. And you'll see that the same fetish on paper with a different underlying root might play out in two opposite ways. I'm going to give an example here. So there were two types of clients that I would get: men that wanted to be feminized as women. Now, there was the first group that I mentioned before, the sissy group, which were a lot of trans questioning folks, and also just really wanted to identify with femininity as part of their sexual pleasure. So it was actually coming from a desire to be a woman, okay? On the other hand, there were clients that wanted to be feminized, but because in their psyche to be feminine was deeply shameful, disgusting, and humiliating. So a lot of these men were misogynists, unfortunately, and that was how it played out in their sexuality. It was like the most humiliating thing that they could be was a woman. So that was how it played out. I actually stopped working with these clients. They were some of the worst clients to work with because they genuinely had this hate towards women. Also, to understand this from a different level, men that hate women and are disgusted by women, want to hurt women, it is a deep repression of their own feminine traits, usually from trauma, that whatever softness they have within them could not be expressed at some point in their life, was considered too feminine. And so now the psyche has turned this and corroded it into a rage or an anger that goes outward. Not saying it's right, especially for those who transgress against women. To me, that is egregious, but that is what's going on from the psychological level. And we're going to talk about this again from the age play perspective. Now, as a mommy dom, like I said, I had lots of littles and they just wanted to be cute and they wanted to be taken care of and they wanted to play with their toys and they wanted to hear mommy read them a book. All right. Then there was the other side of that, which is what they call dark age play. And that's what it sounds like. I had a couple clients that wanted to do this kind of stuff. I've played around with it. Didn't make me feel the most comfortable. But I learned a lot from this. And again, it's the same thing. It's either the deep desire to go back into childhood and to be loved and nurtured and cared for, or there is something about their own innocence that they hate, were denied, couldn't express, and therefore the psyche has kind of turned to protect, really truly to protect that inner child and to protect that innocence. This dark archetype comes up, and the even darker side of that, if it's expressed outward towards actual children, that's where you get pedophilia. It's taken me a long time as someone who was molested as a child to be able to come to this understanding that there is something that's happening in that human being's psyche from their own child abuse that hasn't been addressed, usually due to shame and social stigma, that now their unconscious desires or fears are being enacted on other people, which is never okay. Because I should have mentioned this in the beginning, all kink and BDSM starts with the cornerstone of consent and communication. Children can never consent. If there's anybody listening to this that has desires when it comes down to young people, children, you need to do the work on yourself to heal your own inner child so that you do not offend. Also, this is such a tough, squicky topic for a lot of people. So if you heard what I said and just got very triggered, I totally get it. Like I said, it took me a long time to heal what had happened to me and to come to a place where I actually do have some empathy for people that are struggling with this particular affliction or this particular fantasy. However, again, if you want to engage in any kind of little play with another consenting adult, do that. Absolutely, because both people are consenting. That's all good stuff. Now we're going to talk about fetishes that are rooted in things like shame or fear. And these are ones like small penis humiliation. This was a huge one, okay? I don't know how much money I made off of this kink. Like lots, all right? And it would go like this. A guy would come, he'd want you to look at it and then laugh, make fun of him, humiliate him, tell him how small it was. And this really comes down to this deep fear, anxiety, and shame around penis size, because we live in a culture that tells men, hey, if you're not like 8 inches soft, you're not a man, you know, which is really interesting how we put so much pressure on people for anatomy in this culture about like breast size, dick size, height, all of this stuff. Another one is that forced bisexual, forced gay fetish that I brought up, but under that umbrella is something called CEI, something, eating instructions, okay? This is the consumption of one's own, okay? So this was another one that was huge, just in general, not just for me personally. This was just across the board. Any dominatrix is doing this, and it is a big chunk of their income. And this comes from internalized homophobia amongst men, and men not really being able to express their desires. As women, it doesn't matter, right? We can hook up with a friend at college, we can mess around, we can try it out, and nobody's like, well, you must be gay for life then. Whereas in our culture, you know, if you suck one, you're gay for life. So men have this stigma that they can't even experiment, and which creates a massive homosexual shadow, essentially, in the psyche that will want to get played out, especially if they had a lot of early life shame within their family or within their particular culture or social systems of like that it's really not okay to be homosexual. They might be more likely to have this as a fetish. I've also had clients that wanted to replay scenarios of actual abuse And again, that is and can be very healing for the psyche to play out a abusive scenario sexually with a safe partner that can make sure to give you aftercare and to care for you emotionally during that experience. Again, you want to make sure you're working with someone that you trust. This can be very heavy work, but it is a way for your psyche and your nervous system to play out a trauma and have different positive outcomes at the end that can help heal your unconscious mind. I'm going to have to say from my experience that it is more common than we think that men experience abuse. It's just, again, more stigmatized for them. They're not allowed to talk about it, and it's generally not socially acceptable for them to even go get therapy. So men are silently struggling, and I worked with a lot of them when I did my dominatrix work. Another thing I noticed, I worked with certain clients that had fetishes around materials. So that could be satin panties, it could be shoes, it could be nylons. That's generally what they are. And there seemed to be a common thread here, that there was some point in time where this little boy wanted to dress up in mom's clothes and got horribly shamed for it. And not gonna say in all cases, but in many cases, people that had a really strong fixation on these types of tactile things and needed them in order to it usually got tracked back to something like that. So parents, if you don't want your kids to have some sexual fixation later in life, don't shame them for stuff like that, okay? Because again, and obviously some people aren't going to have a lot of problems with this. They're like, yep, I like to wear heels when I get off, whatever. Or I like to hold nylons while I'm doing my thing, like whatever. Some people, it won't actually cause them any psychological harm later in life. But for some people it will. And I think that we really need to think more about allowing kids to play around with gender expression, with their sexuality, and not throw a shame narrative on them based on your own repression. Because the more I'm learning about shame gets passed down at a generational level. So we all need to be mindful on what shame we carry and how to not pass that along to the younger generation. Another fetish, this one was not as common, but I found very interesting, which was a giantess fetish. Also, this could be kind of lumped in with something called a vor fetish, but it's essentially a fear of the feminine on an archetypal level. It's the devouring feminine, that like this giant woman that is gonna completely consume you, comes and like kills you and eats you. It's this fetish that can play out a bunch of different ways, but the elements are usually the same. It's that there is a really large woman and she is crushing you, killing you, shoving you in an orifice. Or on the other end of that, it is this what's considered unbirthing, which is you shrink really small and then go back up the birth canal, and then maybe even go back into the womb and get nurtured by the feminine. So it's this archetypal fear or desire of being devoured by the feminine to being like held by the feminine. And it comes out in this, what I'll call the giantess fetish, but that's also one that's out there. Now we're going to talk about some other ones that are based on desires. One is goddess worship. So this is the literal worship of the feminine. Men want to call you goddess, queen, serve you. And this is very much deep in the collective unconscious of the psyche, because before the Abrahamic religions, the god was considered feminine because women have wombs. They can create something out of nothing. The feminine was actually much more considered to be God than men were. So essentially the feminine used to be worshipped, and this is still in all of the psyches. And I think men on a very unconscious level still have that little seed of wanting to worship the feminine. It comes out in these unconscious sexual role plays. And the shadow to this too, though, is that it's transgressive in a patriarchy to worship a woman, because in a patriarchal structure, the head of everything is a man, right? The Abrahamic religions really just kind of erased the feminine in God, which is leaving a hole in the collective unconscious and a shadow that wants to be expressed. And this is why dominatrixes exist and they make a lot of money. Another one is chastity or key holding. So this is men that want to wear cages down there and have a woman hold the key and be in complete control of when they can use their equipment. It's a deep desire to be devoted to a woman. And the cage is like the sacrifice that you're willing to give up in devotion to your woman. Also, I've known people that have done chastity, and it is also a deeply spiritual experience, to be honest, and very freeing to discipline this part of your life that might be driving certain decisions that might not be in your best interest. So I also do know there are people that practice chastity for that reason. It's almost like a little bit of a detox. And that can also roll into denial, which is also, that's just a fun one all around. You can tell I like that one, but it's, again, giving someone else control and power over your pleasure in a way that almost feels freeing. Oh, also with mommy play, I didn't do any of this because I did most of my work online, but there's mommy play that is around breastfeeding and diaper changing. And again, it's the feeling of wanting to go back into childhood and be nurtured by the mother. And this could be, honestly, just having a desire to have more connection to the feminine. Or it could be because as a child, you perhaps did not get the love, connection, and nurturing from the mother that you wanted. Another one is furries or pet play. And again, this is almost a little similar, I would say, to littles play. It's this idea of being taken care of and having no responsibility, and all you get to do is play, and that's it, and there is something that's really like freeing about that, that you can express yourself however you want. You can get in touch with your primal desires. So it's a little bit of a mix of like, yes, I'm an animal, so I don't really have to do all these like human responsibility things. And also I can be in touch with like my primal animal instincts, which I think to a degree, we all have this desire to go back to our animal nature and maybe not have to show up to work every day and pay our bills. So it comes from a genuine desire. Again, all of these things that I just talked about as a form of expression with no shame, it can be very good for the psyche. However, there can always be too much of a good thing. And I have seen this, that people will fixate on certain fetishes or fantasies, and it becomes their whole life. It almost becomes like an addiction. If your fantasy life ever, even if it's just your daydreaming, if you're maladaptive daydreaming, if your fantasy life overtakes your everyday, day-to-day life, then that might be cause for concern. On the other hand, if you partake in some of these activities or enact some of your fantasies or fetishes and then feel deep shame, regret, or self-loathing, in both cases, I would seek out a sex coach, a therapist, someone to help you work through these things, to integrate what might be going on in your unconscious mind. What I've noticed is the deeper level of like shame or fear or disgust or that develop and have certain fixations around certain kinks or fetishes, those can become very unhealthy, and it can cause severe emotional distress when it's wrapped in heavy attachment. You got to think about kink play this way. It's like cops and robbers with your pants off. I'll quote Dan Savage on that one, but it's like, it's play. And that's how you should look at it. It's play. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's your unconscious soma and psyche desiring or fearing something. And it's okay to let it out as long as you are not harming yourself or anybody else in the process. So that's it. You have my full permission to get weird. Anyways, y'all, this was a spicy episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Please send me an email if you have any questions about this. I kind of just scratched the surface of BDSM and kink, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I'm going to make a little anonymous Google Forms link, so if you have any questions or wanting any advice on this stuff, I love this topic, so I'll put it in the show notes. If you have anything, I can try to answer it on a future episode, but I'm happy that you guys were here. I also made a free guide I will put in the show notes. It's a little 10-page workbook, but it has a couple exercises in there if you want to start the work to unveil the true self behind the unconscious mind through shadow work. It's short, it's potent, it's filled with prompts that I still use to this day when I get triggered. It's perfect. It also just goes over like what is shadow work, how to get to these parts of yourself. Please go download that if it interests you. Also, if you are struggling with anything around your sexuality, your gender identity, anything that I talked about on this podcast today that you were like, oh my God, that's something that I didn't understand about myself, or I want to do more work around this, I absolutely help people with this stuff. I love this work, and I am accepting clients right now. We just set up a no-cost call. We talk about what your goals are. I send over a proposal, and then you decide what you want to do. My availability is a little limited over the next couple of weeks just because I'm traveling, so if you are interested, make sure to get on my schedule. Other than that, guys, thank you so much for joining, and we will see you next time.